ball rolling here. Good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Elmendorf from AGC New York State. We are glad to be joined this morning by our friends and partners from the New York Independent System Operator. That's a mouthful, and it should be, because they play a critical role in keeping the lights on in New York. They manage New York's power grid and power system. We had the opportunity to bring some members over to the ISO's headquarters in Rensselaer County a few years back, and it was pretty cool. It was sort of like visiting the set of a James Bond movie with all that is going on over there. You know, when you talk about all that's going on, there's a lot going on in this space right now in terms of New York's very ambitious goals to move towards, you know, all renewable energies and eliminate fossil fuels. Some would suggest ambitious maybe is not strong enough a word, right, about to describe those goals. But you know, it certainly creates a lot of challenges, and it also creates some real opportunities, I think, for our industry, for the economy, and for the energy sector. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists this morning, and they are some of the folks in the driver's seat on this. We're joined by Kevin Lanahan, the Vice President of External Affairs and Corporate Communications for the ISO, somebody I've known a long time, and as we've served in a lot of different roles here in and around Albany, as well as Ray Stalter, the Director of Regulatory Affairs, and Gary Davidson, the Regulatory Affairs Principal. So, gentlemen, thanks for joining us this morning, and we look forward to learning about what's going on here and what it means for our industry.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the kind words. We appreciate the invitation to be with you folks today. We've been making the rounds with various different third-party organizations, presenting on a lot of the changes that are happening pursuant to the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019. Our work in that respect, also going through some of the big study reports that we've conducted as of late that talk about the necessary changes in the system and in public policy and regulatory work to meet the goals under the CLCPA. That's what we're going to cover today. We've got a number of slides that we endeavor to get through quickly here, bring you up to speed on that work that I just mentioned, and then we can get to some Q&A. We know that that's where the real interesting conversation happens. And what I'd like to start with first is our new mission and vision, which will give you an idea, if you're not familiar with the New York Independent System Operator, of the core of what we do. So I think, Zach, you're doing the slides, or maybe it's Brendan, but we can move to the next slide real quick.
Kevin, while we're waiting, I just want to make sure the audio is working okay on my computer here.
I can hear you loud and clear, right? You hear me?
I was moving the slides. Were you not seeing them move?
Now we got it on slide 3, so we need to back one up.
And Zach, if you put it in presentation mode, I think it'll display better on the screen.
You know, I may be having some issues here. It's working on my end. I can share this with Brendan if Brendan wants to have the keys.
Yeah, I can do that if you want to shoot over quickly.
All right. All right. Sorry about that. I'll take care of it right now.
Thanks, Zach. In the meantime, I'll give folks a little bit of history. So the Independent System Operator was formed and went live in 1999. But our legacy organization was the New York Power Pool, established by the various different incumbent utilities around the state after a series of large-scale outages had happened. There was a recognition that the utilities needed to come up with a coordinating agency. Those utilities worked with the state of New York to develop the New York Power Pool. It was a function of maintaining reliability of the wholesale electric grid. Coordinating the flow of power across the state to avoid those kinds of wide-scale outages that had occurred. As we moved through the 70s and 80s, of course, there was then a recognition that the electric system, the regulated electric system, for utilities own generation, and then we're responsible for delivery and transportation of the electricity, had become expensive. And
I'm going to email it over to me. I haven't seen.
yeah, there was a recognition that we needed to create a more efficient system. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, so on the federal side, joined with the New York State Public Service Commission. It was interesting because at the time we had a Democrat in the White House with Bill Clinton and a Republican in the governor's mansion, Kentucky, and worked to restructure the industry, force utilities to sell off generation assets, stick strictly to delivery of electricity and energy, and establish competitive wholesale electric markets where they'd be introducing competition, therefore lowering costs and lowering prices for consumers. And again, the New York Independent System Operator was established pursuant to Federal Energy Regulatory Commission proceedings and tariffs. We operate under those tariffs, administer and oversee the competitive wholesale electric markets. We maintain that responsibility of operating the wholesale electric grid. And we are held to the strictest reliability standards in the country. There are federal, state, regional reliability standards that we have to operate to. And then another function of the organization, pursuant again to tariff, is to conduct a planning process that looks at the changes in the system and then makes recommendations for investments that need to be made in order to maintain the reliability of the system that I mentioned. It's a heavily regulated process. Beautiful, there we go. So Zach or Brennan, if you're driving, we can go to that next slide. There we go. So I'll pick it up here. The mission and the vision of the organization are about a year old. The board of directors, along with stakeholders, recognize that the energy landscape had changed significantly since 2019. And as I mentioned, the organization was very focused on reliability and on cost up until last year. That was our mission, operating the system reliably at the lowest cost to consumers. And you can see we've maintained some of those elements in our mission and our vision, but we've expanded that mission to incorporate that renewable externality. And we now endeavor to create the cleanest system in the country, along with that reliability element and that lowest cost element. You can move to the next slide, Brendan. Thanks. So I covered a lot of this while we were trying to figure out the slides here. But again, we have a robust planning function at the ISO. A lot of smart engineers that are just watching roughly on a 10 to 20 year time frame to see how the system is changing pursuant to new policies, new regulation, and as I mentioned, suggesting changes, necessary investments necessary to maintain reliability of the system. And they're very busy, to say the least, these days with changes in policy, but also changes in technology. We're seeing a lot of new technologies wishing to connect to the wholesale grid. That changes the flow of electricity, it changes the impacts to reliability. So the planning engineers are very busy. And those are the folks that have authored the reports that we're going to summarize for you in a minute here. And then the last thing that is a part of what we do, I mentioned reliability, I mentioned operating those wholesale electric markets and planning function. And then the fourth main principle that guides us is to do what we're doing here today and share all this information with folks like you to make sure that the data and the information that we have about the changes in the system are getting to the policymakers, opinion leaders, stakeholders, so that you can see almost in real time what we're seeing as well. Next slide, Brendan. Thanks. So we, as I mentioned, we author and distribute a number of reports on the changes in the system. One of those is called Power Trends, greatly anticipated annual report, basically a state of the grid report that we compile. We begin that effort January, February. It takes us through the spring. We endeavor to get the report out sometime in the summer. And a few takeaways of this year's Power Trends report. First, obviously, the system is dynamic. It's changing in ways that we couldn't have anticipated 5 or 6 years ago. Pursuant to, as I mentioned, the CLCPA, other regulatory changes, but then also advances in the technology. It's becoming a system that's more dependent on renewable generation, and the intermittent nature of that renewable generation means that we're we're quickly making changes to support reliability. We need more transmission built in the state. We're making progress on that, and we've got a slide that will summarize some of that progress to connect the green resources, the renewable resources that are most prevalent in upstate New York, to the load centers in the southern part of the state, Long Island, New York City, 5 boroughs, and Westchester County. That's where the load is. That's where the demand is. And if we're going to achieve the goals of reaching 70% renewable energy by 2030 under the CLCPA and the completely decarbonized electric system in 2040, we are going to have to build transmission to bring those green electrons from upstate New York down to those load centers. Next, we know we have to change. The New York ISO has several rules in place that help guide us in keeping the system reliable and also help guide our administration of the wholesale electric markets. They've been in place, as I mentioned, since 1999. We need to change several of those rules, come up with different market designs to attract and support the new technology while keeping the system reliable. And we're hard at work on those changes as well. Next slide, please. More specifically in the report, a couple more takeaways and key themes here. As we see more renewable intermittent resources connecting to the system and the changes that that intermittency brings, we are also seeing a lower amount of the megawatts in the system that we rely on for those unforeseen circumstances when generators during the summer, for instance, might trip offline, or a transmission line goes out of service suddenly with increased load, or with the prevalence of more extreme weather. Storm rolls in, creates outages. We have built into the system additional megawatts, almost as an insurance policy for accommodating those situations. We are seeing that buffer, that insurance, if you will, starting to erode on a local basis throughout the state, as more fossil fuel traditional generators are leaving the system under the state policies, and more renewable intermittent generation is connecting to the system. And that brings with it, obviously, additional reliability challenges. We need to, as this last bullet articulates, and this is another key theme, we need to balance the retirement of the fossil fuel generators with the renewable generators that are seeking to connect to the system. We cannot allow traditional generators to leave the system without knowing what is going to come in behind it to support the reliability function. It's going to be a careful balance going forward, especially in New York City, pursuant to some Department of Environmental Conservation regulations that are accelerating the retirement of peaker plants down in that part of the state. And that balance is going to be critical as we move forward at an increasing pace to meet the 2030 goal, especially. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Gary Davidson, who's going to walk us through some more specifics of the Power Trends report. And didn't mention it up front, but want to encourage questions and comments along the way. If you have those, please raise a hand. Right, a discussion through the presentation. Over to you, Gary. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Kevin described some of the policy discussion that we have in Power Trends document, and we also get into quite a bit of detail about what our system planning folks are doing and what we're doing in terms of wholesale markets. This set of slides that I'll go through is what we described as the state of the grid section of Power Trends, and it's really an attempt to try to provide some data and some context historically, historical performance of the power grid, as well as where we think things are heading. But before we even get into some of that, Kevin mentioned some transmission work that's taking place, some progress that we're making in terms of building out the system in order to kind of prepare for the future of the grid. And this slide is an attempt to kind of summarize that, how that's happening and what's taking place. A few years back in our Power Trends document, we coined the phrase "tale of two grids," really to describe what's kind of a stark distinction between the grid and the way it operates upstate versus downstate. And of course, we've got our own definition of upstate and downstate. Where effectively we consider downstate the capital region and everything south, whereas upstate is everything kind of north and west of the capital region. And what this slide is showing really is that there is a significant distinction between the way the system is supplied in the two regions. Looking at that pie chart over in Western New York, you can see that 92% of the electricity that we produce on an annual basis, it fluctuates from year to year, but roughly for last year, it was 92% of the electricity that was produced came from zero emitting resources. So that's an important characteristic of the upstate grid. Chief among the goals of the CLCPA is to achieve a zero emissions grid by 2040. Well, the upstate grid is almost there already in terms of the current supply. Contrast that with what we describe as the downstate region, and about 90%, 89% of the electricity supplied in that region comes from fossil fuels. This is 2021 data, so it's actually going to be a little bit skewed further when we start looking at 2022 data, and we see that the loss of Indian Point 2021 included a few months of Indian Point Unit 3 operation. So. And so we'll have sort of an increased dependence in the near term on fossil fuel in that downstate region. Now, there is progress, and this getting to the point Kevin made, there is significant progress being made in terms of transmission build out. And if you look at those highlighted regions, the yellow regions in particular, are ongoing construction transmission build out projects. The project in Western New York is actually already completed in operation. And these are projects that we've identified through our planning process as necessary to meet these public policy goals to achieve zero emissions by 2040, or even to achieve some of the interim goals in terms of renewable energy production. So those transmission projects, like I said, the one in Western New York is complete. The one the one that starts in Central New York and runs down into the Hudson Valley is ongoing, under construction, should be completed by the end of next year. The blue transmission path is what NYPA is pursuing. That didn't come through our planning process, but it very much complements the planning process that we've got underway, and that That project will facilitate increased flow of wind and hydropower from the North Country down into the central region. And subsequently, when we get that corridor built out, there's about 1,000 megawatts of additional flow that will go down into the lower Hudson Valley. Last, I want to draw your attention to the circle on the bottom, connecting Long Island to New York City. This is an ongoing planning process. We've worked closely with the Department of Public Service, the Public Service Commission, to identify another need for transmission investment. This need will ultimately be to move offshore wind that we anticipate being built out over the next decade or so, to move the power at times when there's excess power, to move it off of Long Island into New York City and potentially even into the rest of the state. So that's a significant amount of transmission build out that's underway and being planned through our processes. But that's actually not going to be the extent of the transmission build out that we'll need in order to ultimately achieve the goals. If we could go to the next slide. And so one of the sort of the cornerstones of how we figure out what do we need is you start with anticipating where demand for electricity will be going forward. And we provide 3 different scenarios here. This is produced through our annual gold book. So every year we're looking at updating our forecasts. We've recently increased the outlook from 20 years to 30 years for purposes of load forecasting. Certainly it gets a little uncertain when you're at 30 years out, and you can see there's a range of outcomes that we could potentially see. But all of the outcomes sort of have that same shape. We expect there to be a little bit of a bump up in demand in the near term as we have some particularly upstate load centers that are connecting to the grid, some industrial activity, cryptocurrency activity. That's going to increase demand in the near term. But we see the effects of energy efficiency and behind the meter solar as suppressing that kind of in the midterm, but ultimately electrification of buildings and electric vehicles starts to increase the demand for electricity. The difference is really in these scenarios is the degree to which electrification takes hold in the economy. The high load scenario assumes a much greater adoption of electric vehicles and a much greater adoption of electric heating systems and replacement of gas and other fossil fuel based heating systems. And then the low scenario assumes the opposite, assumes a slower adoption of those types of technologies. So the idea there is really to give a range of outcomes where we may be in the future. If we go to the next slide. One of the outcomes that we see happening in terms of demand is that we expect to become a winter peaking state. And that's significant in terms of how the grid is going to perform in the future, where we get resources from. If you look at this chart, the solid lines represent peak demand from the past year. So summer 2021 peak demand, that was a peak demand day. And then the winter, this most recent winter peak demand day. What you see in the future, in the summer, well, the demand, we expect it to go up a little bit, but it won't be that dramatic. We do expect the peak to happen a little bit later in the day as a result of some of that behind the meter solar I mentioned. But really the significant change we see is in that winter demand, where we become a winter peaking state, and it's fairly significant. It's nearly a doubling of demand over the current winter demand that we see. That saddle in the middle, again, we see that being solar suppressing demand throughout the midday section with behind the meter solar resources. But ultimately those resources go away once the sun sets, obviously, and demand begins to pick up. So we need resources available to the system that we can dispatch in order to meet that demand. If we go on to the next slide. This is just a snapshot. I mentioned behind the meter solar a couple of times. The states put in place aggressive goals for behind the meter solar. Started out at, I think going way back, it was 3,000 megawatts or so, but there's now a goal of 10,000 megawatts by 2030. Our forecasters, our system forecasters, expect that goal to be met. The state's really kind of on track for that target. And so at one point in the past, we realized we can't have this resource out there that affects demand without having some idea of to what degree it is affecting that demand. So we put in place solar forecasting tools that allow us to, in advance, days, potentially even weeks in advance, to kind of forecast what solar contribution may be. But then certainly in real time, we're monitoring what that impact of solar demand is. It's important to do that because that solar resource may or may not be there. As I mentioned, we've got to prepare the system to really meet total demand solar resources are doing. That's if we go on to the next slide. Another rapidly changing area in the grid, we're seeing a lot of interest in storage, both behind the meter storage and directly grid connected storage. Again, there are goals in place through the state and through the CLCPA. The current goal is actually 6,000 megawatts. No, I'm sorry, the current goal is 3,000 megawatts. It was announced in Governor Hochul's State of the State address earlier this year to increase the goal to 6,000 megawatts. That hasn't officially taken place yet. Certainly, I guess we'll expect that to happen through the Public Service Commission. Again, this is an area where our system planners think that the state is relatively on target, even for that increased goal of 6,000 megawatts. The interest in storage is certainly there at both behind the meter and in front of the meter. The difference there, we look at behind the meter storage really as similar to solar. It's moderating demand on the system. It affects how much we supply to the grid. Whereas that grid connected solar will dispatch much like a generator. We'll tell it to supply the grid when there's a need. The added flexibility that storage gives us, though, is that we can actually direct it to absorb energy, to take on energy and effectively work as a load. So if there are times when there's additional renewable energy that can't otherwise be used, we can take advantage of that and use that for charging storage resources that can be dispatched later. Next slide, please. And I'll turn things over, with that slide, I'll turn things over to Ray.
Thanks, Gary. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Good morning to all of you. Why don't we go to the next slide? I'm going to walk you just through a little bit of a profile of our markets and some of the transition that we're seeing take place. Again, as mentioned earlier, if you have any questions or comments that you want to raise along the way, please feel free to do so. First, we'd like to take a look at here is our generating capacity. What we talk about here and in the next slide will be, this is basically a snapshot of what we have available to the system today. This is the resources that we have available on the system coming into this summer. And what you see here is really a profile of the state as a whole, and then what we call upstate versus downstate. Again, that tale of two grids that Gary referred to earlier. This is a bit of a deeper dive into that. So the story, the key takeaways here are, statewide, 70% of the capacity we have available, and again, these are the resources we have available to serve demand on the system. Those are fossil fuel resources. So they're natural gas or dual fuel, which would be the ability to burn natural gas or some sort of other fuel like oil or distillate and the like. Where you see a real, where you see this story of the detailed two grids kind of illustrated more clearly here is the upstate, and we refer to upstate as essentially everything west and north of the capital region. And then downstate, which is basically the capital region south down the Hudson Valley to New York City and Long Island. When you look at the system in those terms, you see that 2/3 of the capacity we have available in upstate New York are emission-free resources. A lot of hydro, a lot of wind, nuclear is available to us in the upstate part of the state. Downstate, we have a very different story. Excuse me, over 90% of the resources we have available are fossil fuel resources. We have combined cycle units, what we refer to as peaking units. You hear that term a lot here. Those are units that don't run too often, but they do run under conditions where we have a lot of demand on the system, or the system may be constrained in some way. Those resources become very important for us from a reliability perspective. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move along. If we can go to the next slide. So this is production now. This is a snapshot of all of the production within the state over the course of last year. We take a look at the state as a whole when we do that. It's a little bit of a different story than what you see on the capacity side. Again, capacity is the resources we have available. Production is is a snapshot of the actual electricity that was produced by those same resources. Why do you see a difference? Well, you see a difference because of our wholesale competitive markets. All those resources that you saw on the capacity side are competing every day to produce energy, to meet demand, to keep the lights on in your offices and in this room that I'm in right now. Every 5 minutes, every hour of every day, those resources are competing with each other. The least cost mix of resources are the ones that are being selected by the NYISO. And that we are constantly redispatching the system with those least cost mix of resources in mind. All of that, of course, is designed to make sure that we're maintaining reliability as we're doing all of that. So when you see production, now you see a very different story here. 50% of the resources that provided electricity within the state last year were emission free. Why is that the case? Well, because those zero emission resources like hydro and wind in particular don't have a fuel that they need to produce electricity. So they're often bid in at very low costs, and then therefore will get selected more often in our daily energy markets. You see that story played out further in this, again, this tale of two grids in upstate and downstate. Over 90% of the resources selected and they actually produced electricity last year from the upstate resources were emission-free resources. Again, you see that very different tale downstate. Nearly 90% of the resources selected downstate to produce electricity were fossil-fired generation resources. Again, that's a reflection of what we have available to us. It's also a reflection of some of the constraints in our transmission system that while we have a robust system, that we're continuing to invest in the system in order to get more access downstate where there's a great deal of demand to the resources that we have available upstate, which are emission free. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Gary's talked about that a little bit in terms of the transmission projects that we have underway. If we can go to the next slide. We talk a lot about this transition to a clean energy grid. And since markets have come into place back in 2000, we've seen this transition where resources, older resources coming off the system, often they are resources that are less efficient, maybe not have the same efficiency levels from both an economic perspective and frankly from an emissions perspective. And what you see are resources coming onto the system at the same time. So this chart illustrates that. It goes a little bit to what Kevin was talking about earlier when we have this idea of shrinking margins. Having excess resources available to us is very important from the perspective of making sure we have a resilient grid. We are meeting our reliability standards. We have very strict standards that we have to meet to make sure we have the resources available to us. But there continue to be different kinds of risks that we encounter that we need to plan for. Extreme weather, for instance, is one of them. So having a strong margin of resources available to us really helps us maintain a resilient grid to those types of risks. Point out in particular here, what you see over the last, last 3 years is, certainly a trend of more resources coming off the system than are coming onto the system. Of note there, those last 2 years in particular reflect the departure of the Indian Point facility in lower New York. So that has an impact on the availability of resources that we have, obviously. This also points to the strong need to continue to have resources coming onto the system at a good pace. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because we've done some study work on that. If we go to the next slide. This illustrates the shrinking margin concept even further. So we've done some study work to look at, these trends of margins, of the shrinking margins. This is important, again, because of the resilience factor, the resilience benefits and reliability benefits of having these resources. What we're trying to do is understand as we make this transition, as these fossil units that are leaving the system, and clean energy resources coming onto the system, how does that impact, this trend that we're seeing? So what you see over here, the next, call it next 7 or 8 years now, is that shrinking set of margins. We have it broken down by region. So Zone A would be the Buffalo region, the Hudson Valley that we talked about, New York City, and again, Long Island. Again, it's a trend that we're watching very closely to make sure that that we continue to maintain the reliability standards we have in place. Kevin's going to talk a little bit about some of the planning work that we have underway and we've just completed. We can go to the next slide. And I think that is the transition to Kevin. So thank you, and certainly looking forward to all of your questions. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Ray, I'm going to move through the final couple slides here pretty quickly, so we can go to the next slide, Brendan. And so Ray mentioned how we've adapted our planning process a bit. I talked about that up front. We've got to adapt our planning process to the changes that we're seeing in the system and the changes that we're seeing in public policy. So we have just issued, for the first time ever, what we call a system and resource outlook. This is a study that looks, I mentioned up front that, generally the planning department was looking at things in a 10-year time horizon. Well, that need has changed, especially with the 2040 goals and the CLCPA. So now we're looking at things on a 20-year time frame, trying to plan for those goals and what's necessary to meet those. So we, the system and resource outlook does that, comes up with multiple cases and scenarios that we hope help identify where those transmission investments are necessary that we keep talking about, where the project resource mixes for achieving the policy goals are necessary, how to do that, recognizing that there's probably not just one option, that there's probably a couple ways that we can get to these goals while maintaining reliability. So what are those scenarios that we looked at? First is the baseline case. So this is like a business as usual type scenario, looks at the electric system, roughly how it performs today, and what an as found system, defining the demand, the generation, the transmission assumptions that we're basing the function of the system on today. The second scenario or case that we looked at was, okay, if we now take into account all of the projects that the state is financing through the Renewable Energy Credits Program, and look at all those project awards, what kind of a system are we looking at into the future based on that scenario? The third case or scenario that we looked at was assuming all the federal, state, and local policy mandates that are going to impact the system, and assuming what we're going to need to invest in order to meet those goals. What does that look like? So how do we achieve the 2040 goals, and what's necessary to change in pursuit of those mandates? And what we found was, 4 main takeaways that we'll highlight today. First, the policies are driving a need for unprecedented levels of investment in new generation. We are anticipating, and there's roughly about 36 megawatts in the system today, that we're going to have 20 I'm sorry, 36 gigawatts of resources on the system today. We're going to need an extra 20 gigawatts by 2030 in order to meet that goal while maintaining reliability. And then we're going to need somewhere between 111 and 124 gigawatts total in the system by 2040. An extraordinary amount of investment, unprecedented level of investment in order to meet those goals while maintaining reliability. 2, electrification of buildings and transportation required by the state policies and policies in New York City are going to rapidly increase peak demand, annual energy demand, and that comes with its own set of challenges. 3, as we keep talking about today, extensive investment in the transmission system beyond what we were anticipating previously. And then 4th, in order to achieve this emissions-free grid, we're going to have to come up with a type of resource that has the same characteristics of our fossil fuel generation today. And yeah, thanks for moving the slide to the next one. Thanks, Ray. We're going to need resources that have those attributes and characteristics of the current fossil fuel fleet on the system, but without the emissions profile. And that technology does not exist today. And we're going to need that technology at scale, commercially available by 2035. We're going to have to identify what that is. It could be green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, a mix. It could be some other resource that's in R&D currently. People talk about small scale nuclear, but we are going to need that at scale, commercially available. We're going to need to start building it, connecting it to the grid by 2035 so that we can meet those 2040 goals. In other words, to wrap this up for you folks today, this is an unprecedented level of change, investment, and planning for our state's electric grid. And in order to meet reliability and avoid those kinds of situations that we've seen as recently as this summer in California, where they had trouble balancing demand with supply, we are going to have to move with great speed and be also very careful about that balance between what's coming off of the system through this process and what's coming out of the system. So we'll wrap it up there. Hope that was some food for thought, and we're happy to take any questions. Again, Mike, we appreciate the audience today, and we'll make the slides available to you folks if that's of interest.
No, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for that very informative presentation. Brendan, do we have questions? Do we need to tell people how to ask their questions?
We don't have any questions at this point. You should all have a Q&A box to be able to click on and type in your question. Probably should have covered that at the beginning. Hopefully, most of us are using Zoom, but not everybody does. So at this point, I do not see any questions asked. If anybody has any questions that they think of after the program, please feel free to shoot them over. We can certainly get them to our panelists today, and we'll get back to you on that. But oh, here comes one right now. Okay, I don't know if everybody can see that. How do you see the consumers in New York State being able to afford this through their rates and the amount that is going to be needed to pay for this investment?
That's usually one of the first 3 questions we get in these presentations, the issue of cost. And we have not calculated the costs. It's not part of our role. We do recognize that the costs, especially with the point that I made about the unprecedented level of build out and investment necessary, is going to be enormous. When you think about offshore wind investments alone, likely to be quite expensive. First, we have to get through this winter, and the winter pricing forwards that we see, and we've begun to communicate this, give us great pause and great concern. So I think the issue and the question of how to pay for all this investment, along with, at least in the immediate future and for this coming heating season, the constraints on supply, that are caused by, among other things, geopolitical issues and post-pandemic economic issues, just to add to the complexity and the challenge of shouldering the investment necessary. So we don't do cost studies. We haven't done those, but I think it's fair to say that this investment is going to be unprecedented, and there are questions across the various different interests about how we're going to finance it all. It's not really an answer to your question, but is a recognition that that is an enormous issue.
Okay, the next question that has come in is, what would be the most effective way to balance / achieve the CLCPA goals while ensuring adequate energy supply?
Yeah, another great question. I think I'll start here. The answer is beginning to recognize that careful balance that we keep talking about may mean that we need to shift our focus a bit from is this peaker plant or this fossil fueled resource, does it stay or does it go? And shift our focus and ask the question, how much do these resources run? So if we because we may need to keep them on the system longer than we anticipated and longer than some of our environmental justice communities want. But if they're running less and we can maintain them through this transition period in pursuit of those reliability goals, that also can spell success in the bridge to getting to the 2040 goal. If we are focused on whether plants are on the system or they're off the system, we are likely going to find ourselves in a tight spot of how to meet those reliability goals. And we do not, as I mentioned, want to put ourselves in the same kind of situation that California experienced this summer, where they're asking folks to turn thermostats way up or not use certain appliances, and desperate to find that supply in when the temperatures are reaching 100 degrees. Ray, Gary, I don't know if you guys want to chime in here.
I guess I would just add, that question is such a key question for us and the planning work that we've been doing and continue to do. We have reliability planning. We developed a comprehensive reliability plan that we issue every 2 years. We issued that late last year. We have another reliability plan coming out later this year that's going to continue to look out 10 and 20 years to try to make sure that we understand, we in those slides that we spoke to here a little bit about that transition of resources coming on and off the system, so that we're able to project the implications for that transition while other policies are going into effect, policies that increase demand because of electrification, for instance, electrification of the transportation sector of the economy. Trying to make sure that we understand that transition and continue to educate and inform as we go is really important. We've been active in the Climate Action Council and one of the subcommittees to try to be informative in that way as well. We've changed some of our planning processes. We just had this outlook study that Kevin briefed you on. We do long-term studies, and then we do very quick quarterly updates to those reliability studies. Again, trying to understand this transition, get ahead of it, and where we do identify reliability needs, work with the asset owners, the utilities, and the policymakers to make sure that we're moving as quickly as possible to address those gaps if they occur.
Great. That is it for questions. I want to thank everybody for your time and commitment. Ray, Gary, and Kevin, appreciate the presentation today. Again, we are recording this, so we will make sure anybody that wants to go back and rewatch will certainly post it for the membership as well. So.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, Mike. I think in closing, I'll just make the point that, in one way or another, we think about this at the NYISO because in one way or another, we know the function and our job. In one way or another, it supports every New Yorker in the state, the economy, health and safety, well-being and livelihood of New Yorkers. So everybody's got a stake in these issues and the state's decisions on how to move forward. We have a wealth of information on our website. I encourage folks to go there and check out our blogs. We produce podcasts. We have summaries of the study work there that you can look at that we talked about today. We just encourage folks to stay engaged and involved. We're happy to have shorter conversations aside from these presentations, but it's we endeavor to reach out to third parties, make sure everybody's got the same information that we have as we go through this grid and transition.
Great.
Great.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Ray. Thanks, Gary.
Our
Very
pleasure.
informative presentation. Look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, guys.